Ooh. Okay. Whew. Okay. Let's kind of get this started. Let's go with the sublime object of ideology. This is mainly a video test, and largely it's just for me to get this camera working, but if there's any other videos you want me to like talk about very briefly, I can do that as well. I think the easiest way to think about the sublime object of ideology is in this section here, where he says, so this is on page 230, where Zizek says, the sublime is the sublime is the paradox of an object in which the very field of representation provides a view in a negative way of the dimension of what is unrepresentable. It is a unique point in Kant's system, a point at which the fissure, the gap between phenomenon and thing in itself, is abolished in a negative way, because it is in the phenomenon's very inability to represent the thing adequately is inscribed in the phenomenon itself. And then there's another section here that I thought is like really useful, in which he talks about the, oh my god, where the hell is it? And so, wrong chapter. In short, the sublime object of ideology is this book from 1989, I believe, by Slavoj Žižek. And it's actually kind of a really interesting text in itself. It's oftentimes considered to be like one of his strongest, or perhaps his strongest text. And Žižek gets a lot of shit, right? And a lot of it is kind of like rightful, because he is kind of a weird dude who has some really jankaroni takes. But I do think the sublime object of ideology, as well as his discussion about ideology, is nevertheless incredibly useful and very, very prevalent in a lot of ways. And we can actually end up applying that in a lot of different contexts. Generally, what I want to talk about in short is this idea of ideology as having a sublime object and what the hell that's supposed to mean. And I'm going to try and do this as short and as simply as I possibly can. Because remember, this is just a test video, so I'm just trying to figure out how to get this whole thing working. The idea here is that Zizek is arguing that when we're dealing with ideology, right, it's not so much like it is simply this political thing that we can point at and then say, well, you know, that is itself ideological. That thing over there is ideological. But rather, ideology is a series, is sort of like an infinite quilt. It's like a point where like you can't really suss out the exact sort of central point of it, but rather you can sort of approximate the things that kind of revolve around it based upon where you think you are situated, or it situates its subjects. So, what the hell is going on? What's going on with ideology? Well, Zizek essentially argues that ideology functionally has what he calls a sublime object. And the reason why he's using these arguments is because he's drawing directly from Lacan. Side note, so one of the things that's really important when we're talking about ideology in the context of Zizek is that he's trying to essentially save Hegel through Lacan. And therefore we have to kind of very briefly explain what Lacan is talking about. So Lacan is essentially saying that psychoanalysis functions like a language. When a person ends up becoming like a really formed subject, they end up taking the trappings of language. And the language in this context is not simply the language that we speak, but also the way in which we present ourselves in relation to the world around us. We take the things that are out there, and then we essentially just sort of like embody or entrap or sort of take on those elements. So why is this particularly important? Well, Lacan essentially says, well, there is a part at the very end of this which he calls the real. And the real is, in effect, this thing that escapes language, the thing that's like kind of like out there that's escaping it. And so in this context, Zizek says, well, hold on, wait a minute. This is kind of very similar in the context of ideology. Ideology is a series of sort of atmospheric guidelines that might not necessarily always make sense, especially if it's based upon somebody who might not be necessarily within that particular ideology. So how does it actually deal with those particular kinds of issues or contradictions? Well, what ends up happening, it turns out, is that there is a sort of negotiation that ends up happening as a result of subjects being within an ideology. They deal with these sorts of issues by essentially sort of acknowledging the existence but never directly outlining the sublime object. So what the hell is the sublime object? So the sublime object, in short, I just realized I wasn't looking at the camera this whole time. So the sublime object in God damn it. So the sublime object, in short, is this negotiation between the real and the language that's supposed to be a representation of a subject's understanding of the sort of relation of the real in regards to the world around it. And what happens here is that the sublime object is a sort of instance. It's a sort of moment in which somebody has a sort of approximation. It's not actually the thing of the real itself. It's not supposed to be that thing. But it is an approximation that works in a way that is upheld by the unknowability of the real, and then ultimately that ends up being a sort of orbital fixation point of ideology. So what the hell does that mean? Well, it essentially means that ideology, these guidelines, these atmospheric guidelines, as Jonathan Bale would call them, it's actually sort of like at the center. There's a black hole. You might think of it in this way. And in this black hole is that sublime object, this approximation of the real. And sometimes this particular sort of approximation can be not necessarily just have to be a sort of object-based real, but something that cannot necessarily be described, and not described in very particularly compelling ways. For instance, let's sort of apply that, right? We might look at it in the context of, like, say, for example, like Rorikon, right? What is at fundamentally I can't talk about that on YouTube. Not with these COVID changes. I don't think. That might get me in trouble. I don't know.